Dr. Anthony Harper here, blessed to be in Jerusalem, and I'm with a special person here, David. How do you pronounce your last name?
Hacham.
Hacham.
Yeah, as I've told you before, it's a Hebrew name. Hebrew word means wise, but in my case, Hacham is the shortened version of Hacham Bashi, which means a chief rabbi. And my great-grandfather was the chief rabbi of the Jewish community in Babylon, in Baghdad, during the 20th, the beginning of the 20th century. And he was the leader, the spiritual leader, as well as a religious leader of the Jewish community in Iraq, yes.
I know you're going to be sharing the importance about Israel's security, having a strong Israel, but for those that, I'd like to know about your military background. So what has been your experience with the Army here?
Yes.
In your position in the past?
As a matter of fact, I served for 30 years in the military, in the IDF, in the Israeli Defense Forces. I am in the rank of reserve colonel of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces. And during my military service, I served in various intelligence corps, intelligence units of the army. I served for a couple of years in the Mossad, in the Israeli Mossad. And later on, I was in the intelligence, in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, in the research, unit of the intelligence. And later on, I served for almost 8 years in the Gaza Strip. I was the advisor of the commanders of the Southern Command. And later on, during my military service in Gaza, I knew all the Palestinian, leaders, beginning from the far left and going on all the circle to the radical Islamic fundamental figures or leaders. In this respect, I would like to mention maybe Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. I don't know if the name is familiar to you, but he was the guy who was behind the establishment of Hamas. Hamas was established a couple of days after the eruption of the First Intifada. The First Intifada was erupted the 9th of December 9th, 1987. At the 14th of December that year, Hamas was established in Gaza by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. He was a paralyzed guy, he's on a wheelchair, and I knew him personally. As a matter of fact, I knew the other leaders of the PLO in Gaza. And later on, I was very much involved in the Oslo process. I was the representative of the Minister of Defense and the Army in the negotiations with the Palestinians. That period of time, Chairman Yasser Arafat. I took place in many meetings which were that period of time during the Oslo process in the 90s. By the way, only a couple of days ago, we marked 29 years for the beginning of the Oslo process. It was begun at September 13th, 1993. So today, to 2020, we are 2022. We are 29 years after the signing of the first agreement between Israel and the PLO with Chairman Arafat. It was at the White House lawn under the presidency of President Bill Clinton. I don't know if you remember this. In the White House lawn, Yitzhak Rabin from the Israeli side, he was the Israeli Prime Minister that period of time, and Chairman Arafat from the other side, under the auspices of the American administration, President Clinton. This was at the September 13th, 1993. Later on, during this Oslo process, I was in many meetings with Chairman Arafat during this period of time. And as a matter of fact, after I completed my military service, I was the advisor for Arab affairs for 7 Israeli ministers of defense, beginning with Yitzhak Mordechai. Yitzhak Mordechai was the Israeli Minister of Defense. As a matter of fact, he was my commander in Gaza when he was the commander of the Southern Command, and other ministers as well during the 2000s years. I was like 30 years in the military and 15 years in the Ministry of Defense as an advisor for Arab affairs. And during, by the way, my period of time as advisor for ministers of defense, I participated in the meeting with Arab leaders President Mubarak, the late President Mubarak of Egypt, President Sisi, the nowadays president in Egypt, King Hussein of Jordan, his son King Abdullah, the present king of the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, and other Arab leaders. And I visited many Arab countries during my period of time as advisor for the Ministers of Defense. This is in short, and I would like only to mention that I published until now 2 books, and the 3rd book is now in a process of being published. The first book about Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the crippled guy, the paralyzed guy, who was behind the establishment of Hamas in the territories. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, his name. Later on, I published a book about the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising, and the 3rd book about our relations with the Arab Republic of Egypt during the last 30 years, the Israeli-Egyptian relations, basically on the security strategic level between us and the Egyptians. And during the last couple of years, it's very much important because I sent you a couple of my articles.
Yes.
I'm publishing, on a regular basis, articles in American press, in American newspapers, about the current issues in the Middle East, basically about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And this I'm doing, on a very, in a permanent basis during the last couple of years.
Okay, the big issue of all this, I think, is Israel's security. So what would you like to say about why it's important to have a strong Israel, and how does a Palestinian state dividing Israel threaten the security of Israel?
Yes. First of all, you touched I think, the number one issue, number one challenge which is facing Israel in the area of the Middle East. We are, a country, a state of only 7 million Jews, surrounded by an ocean of Muslims. I'm speaking about our Muslims, and at the same breath, I'm speaking about Iran, which is not an Arab country. But we are surrounding with 300 millions of Muslims in the area. And I think, for myself, when I'm thinking about it, it's like a miracle that Israel is still in existence in this area, because we are surrounding with enemies that would like, at the end of the day, to exterminate the Israeli Jewish state, the only Jewish state on earth. And this is something we have to take into consideration. This is, at the same time, I must tell you that this is the security issue, is number one challenge facing Israel. And this is why we need to be a strong country in terms of our military might, our military abilities. And we need, for that, a strong ally like the United States of America. Since the birth of Israel in 1948, the independence of Israel, and I still remember that period of time, President Truman, he was brave enough to recognize the Jewish state, the young Jewish state, and to give Israel support, moral support, and of course military support, in order to exist in this part of the world. As I've told you before, we are surrounded by an ocean of Muslim countries that would like, at the end of the day, to Israel to be disappeared from the area. And this is number one strategic, I would say, challenge which is facing Israel in the area. So we need a very, I would say, very prominent support from the United States of America in order to stay alive in this part of the world. And I have to mention to you at the same breath that when the Zionist movement was in the 19th century was established, the coming back to Zion is something deeply rooted in the Jewish belief. You have to understand, we are coming to the land of Israel, the land of our forefathers, the land of our ancestors. The biblical period of time. That there was a temple, the temple in Jerusalem that was destructed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. What happened during the Roman period of time here in Israel, 70 AC, the second temple was destructed. So we are coming to a land of our forefathers in order to rebuild and revive our Jewish independence in this part of the world. And this is something that everybody must know in terms of the Israeli ambitions and the Israeli history, etc., etc. And this is a fact of life. As a matter of fact, I must tell you in this regard, your name is Matthew, your first name.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I don't know if you know what is the origin of your name.
Okay.
Listen very much carefully. It's very much important. Your name is a Hebrew name. As a matter of fact, your name, Matthew, in Hebrew is Matityahu. Matthew Matityahu. In English, Matthew means nothing. In Hebrew, Matityahu means the gift of the Lord, the present of the Lord. And Matthew Matityahu was the father of the 5 sons who made the rebellion against the Greeks 200 BC. And this is why we are celebrating every year Hanukkah, you know, the Festival of Lights.
Yes.
And Matthew was the father of the 5 sons, including, when I'm mentioning the 5 sons, you know, Judea the Maccabee. This was one of the sons of Matthew, of Matityahu. And Yohanan, and the youngest one was Jonathan. Again, Jonathan in English means nothing. Jonathan in Hebrew means a lot. Jonathan means Yonatan, the Lord gives or is giving. This is the name, the significant, the meaning of the name.
Besides that, first name Matthew, does the middle name Anthony connect to anything Hebrew?
Anthony, I don't know any connection to Hebrew.
Okay.
But Matthew is Matityahu. This is the pronunciation in Hebrew of your name. And as I've told you before, he is the father of the 5 sons who made the rebellion against the Greeks. And this is why we are celebrating Hanukkah. You know why we are celebrating Hanukkah? Because Judea the Maccabee, by the way, he succeeded in fighting against the Greeks, in coming to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount, liberated the temple, and there was like an oil which were only sufficient for 1 day, but there was a miracle, and the oil was sufficient for 8 days. And this is why we are celebrating every year the feast of Hanukkah, you know, Hanukkah,
Yes, I've been here.
the Festival of Light, every year for the ancient, you know, victory of Judea the Maccabee over the Greeks. Now, I must tell you in this regard, you know, it's very much important what I'm going to tell you now. In Judea and Samaria, you know, there are many Palestinian Arab villages. But you know names of villages in the area in Arabic, in the Arabic style. But as a matter of fact, all these villages are, I mean, the names are preserving the ancient, old, biblical names of these places. It's unbelievable what I'm telling you. For instance, in Hebron district, you know, Hebron, it's a biblical place. But there is like a village, Palestinian village called Samua. Samua is Eshtamoa, the biblical place. You know, take for instance, many other, Anata. What is Anata in the area of Jerusalem? Very close to here, by the way. Anata is Anatot, the birthplace of the prophet Jeremiah. And you take for instance, the village, Palestinian village called Taqwa. There is, by the way, a settlement very close to Taqwa, to this Palestinian village. Taqwa is Tekoa, the birthplace of the prophet Amos. You know, and if you are taking any single place in the West Bank, any village, Palestinian village today, you dig a little bit in the name, you find the ancient biblical Jewish Hebrew name of these places. So this is another, I would say, indication to the, I would say, to our linkage, our links, you know, from the historical point of view to the land here in Judea and Samaria. And I'm not saying West Bank,
Right.
you know, West Bank is like, it's not a real, you know, term for what we're speaking about. We are speaking about Judea and Samaria.
Yeah, I think it would be important to say it this. I want to conclude with this issue about, for those that don't understand real history, I want to make it clear that the word Palestine was an invention of the Roman Emperor Hadrian in about 122 A.D., that this Roman emperor that had a disdain, almost a hatred for the Jewish people, he renamed this area Palestine, and that lie continues today. Mm-hmm. So please, understand history about this whole issue, the word Palestine, that it's really the land of Judea and Samaria. It is Israel's land. It's not Palestinian land, and it's definitely not the Philistines.
Yeah, you are 100% right. 100% right. And I'll tell you more than that. The word Palestine is, as a matter of fact, the origins are from the period in which Goyei Hayam, the nations of the sea, or how to call it, the peoples of the sea. And here I'm referring to those Greeks that came from the island of Crete, some hundreds BC to the land of Israel. They called Plishtim in Hebrew, which means Philistines. Mm-hmm. And in this respect, I must tell you that the most known, event in this regard is the fight between David, young David, David, as you said before. He was like a teenager, and he fought against Goliath.
Yes.
And who is Goliath? Goliath, a gigantic man representing the Plishtim, the Philistines, that came to Israel. They established here 5, garrison cities or garrison towns, one in Gaza, Ekron, and other places in Israel. And the fight between young David and Goliath was between, young David as a boy of the Jewish Hebrew community, and Goliath, the Philistines that came to conquer here the land of Israel. And the Philistines, in this regard, it's like an artificial name given to the Arabs here in the land of Israel. Because the Philistines of today, the Palestinians, they came from Arab countries. They came from Saudi Arabia, from Syria, even from Egypt. And this is like an artificial, word. And there is no connection, historical connections between the Arabs and the land of Israel.
And along with that issue, to correct the history issue, that people call Palestinians really are really a lot acting like Philistines. And I want to conclude with that issue to check out the history of the issue of Palestine really being a myth created by the Roman Emperor Hadrian. And I thank you for joining me today about this issue and helping correct history, help people to understand the importance of Israel. So thank you.
Thank you, and I want to tell you in this regard that I have a very much honor for you, for what you are doing. And I think you are true friends of Israel and trying, of course, to reveal the real history and the real connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. I mean, in accordance what is written in the Holy Scriptures, in the Bible, and this is very much important. And thank you very much for that.
It's a blessing to be with you, and thank you for meeting with me. There are a couple of scriptures in the Old Testament for people to look up regarding blessing Israel, and that's Genesis 12:3, the warning of dividing up Jerusalem in Zechariah 12:3, and of course the warning about dividing Israel, which is in the prophet Yoel, or Joel chapter 3 verse 2, which says, "For God enters into judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat, the nations that divide up his land and scatter his people." And this is what is going on right now. A lot of people are pushing to divide Israel, to scatter the Jewish people, and God is angry against those people that do that. So we need to get the truth out and for people to understand true history, and I look forward to talking with you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.